Marcus Johnson adjusted his rearview mirror, taking a deep breath as he prepared to start his new delivery route. The suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Hills was known for its wide streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and a quiet that could be both calming and eerie. He had been assigned this route only a week ago, but the difference from his previous deliveries was palpable. The neighborhood was affluent, the kind of place where residents knew one another, and newcomers were regarded with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. As Marcus rolled through the neighborhood, he couldn't help but feel the eyes on him. He'd gotten used to that feeling over the years. Being watched, evaluated, it came with the job, especially in neighborhoods like this. His bright white delivery truck with the company logo was an unmistakable sign that he was there to do his job. And yet the stares told him they didn't just see a delivery man. They saw someone out of place. Still, he had a job to do. Pulling up to his first stop, Marcus parked the truck and grabbed the brown package from the back. It was a light box addressed to a Mr. Anderson at 125 Oakwood Lane. He hopped out of the truck and made his way toward the modest brick house, the sound of his footsteps the only noise breaking the silence. As he approached the front door, Marcus glanced around the quiet street, the sun beating down on the carefully manicured lawns and flower beds. Just as he placed the package neatly on the doorstep, Marcus caught movement from the corner of his eye. Across the street, a man was standing on his porch, watching him intently. Marcus kept his movement steady, his hand brushing over the brim of his delivery cap. The man was in his late 50s, wearing a faded gray t-shirt and cargo shorts. His posture was rigid, and his gaze was fixed. No friendly wave, no smile, just a cold, hard stare. "Hey!" the man called out, his voice sharp enough to slice through the thick summer air. Marcus sighed inwardly. He had been through this before. He turned to face the man, keeping his expression neutral. "Yes, sir," he replied calmly, standing next to his truck with the door still open. "What are you doing?" the man asked, crossing his arms over his chest and stepping closer to the curb. His tone was accusatory, as if Marcus had no right to be there. "I'm delivering a package, sir," Marcus said, gesturing to the box he'd just left on the doorstep. "Just doing my job." The man narrowed his eyes. "I've never seen you around here before." Marcus offered a tight-lipped smile, fighting the urge to roll his eyes. "I'm the new delivery driver for this area. I started a few days ago." The man didn't budge, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe. "You sure that's all you're doing? Been watching you, and you've been looking around a lot." Marcus clenched his jaw but kept his tone even. "Yes, sir. Just deliveries. That's all." He gestured toward the truck behind him, the company's logo emblazoned across the side in bright blue letters. "The uniform, the truck, they're all part of my job." The man didn't seem convinced. He took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. "I've lived here for over 20 years. Never seen anyone like you before. I don't trust what I can't explain." Marcus inhaled deeply, reminding himself to stay calm. He had encountered this kind of reaction many times before, especially in places like Oakwood Hills. It was part of the job, dealing with the suspicious stares, the assumptions, the questions. "Look, sir," Marcus said, his patience wearing thin but his voice steady. "If you've got any concerns, you can call the company. They'll confirm I'm assigned to this route." The man didn't back down. His voice grew louder, frustration bubbling beneath his words. "That's what they all say. Next thing you know, packages go missing." Marcus shook his head and turned back to his truck. He didn't have time for this. There were still more deliveries to make. As he reached for the next package, he could feel the man's eyes burning into his back. He hoped that would be the end of it, but he knew better. Something about the man's demeanor told Marcus that this wasn't over. Just as Marcus placed the next package in his hands, the man crossed the street, moving closer, his face twisted with suspicion. "Hey!" the man called again, louder this time. "I've been watching you. You think people don't notice what you're doing?" Marcus exhaled, turning to face him. "Sir, I'm just doing my job. Delivering packages, that's it. If there's a problem, maybe you should call the company." "Oh, I will," the man replied, his voice full of certainty. "But don't think I'm just going to let you walk around here like you own the place. This is my neighborhood, and I don't need people like you snooping around." Marcus bit back a retort, knowing it wouldn't help. "Have a nice day, sir," he said simply, turning back to his truck. As Marcus climbed into the driver's seat, he caught sight of a woman standing a few houses down, watching the exchange unfold. She was tall, with light brown hair pulled into a ponytail and a slight frown creasing her brow. Her arms were crossed, but she hadn't said anything. Marcus gave her a quick nod before starting the truck, hoping to finish his route without further incident. The day dragged on as Marcus continued making deliveries, but the encounter with the man on Oakwood Lane stayed with him. It wasn't the first time he had been accused of something just for being in the wrong neighborhood, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But each time it left a mark, a weight that settled deep in his chest and was hard to shake off. As Marcus pulled up to the next house, his phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from his wife, Melanie. "How's the new route?" Marcus smiled despite the tension still lingering in his mind. "Same as always," he replied. "Nothing I can't handle." But even as he sent the text, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man from earlier wasn't done yet. There was something in his eyes, something that made Marcus uneasy. Later that afternoon, as Marcus was nearing the end of his route, the man appeared again, this time standing in the middle of the street as Marcus's truck approached. He wasn't alone this time. Another neighbor had joined him, and together they stood with their arms crossed, blocking Marcus's path. Marcus slowed the truck to a stop and sighed. He knew where this was going. Stepping out of the truck, Marcus approached them cautiously. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" The man from earlier, Derek, smirked. "You think you can just walk around here like nobody's watching? I know what you're up to." "Just delivering packages," Marcus replied, keeping his tone measured. "You've been snooping around. You don't belong here," Derek said, his voice growing louder. The second man, older and more hesitant, glanced between Marcus and Derek but said nothing. Marcus crossed his arms, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Look, I've already explained this. I'm just doing my job." Derek's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that. I've already called the police." The sound of a siren in the distance made Marcus's stomach drop. This wasn't going to end well. Officer Stephen Reynolds arrived within minutes, his cruiser pulling up behind Marcus's truck. As he stepped out of the car, he adjusted his sunglasses and approached the group cautiously. "Afternoon, gentlemen. What seems to be the problem?" Derek wasted no time. "He's been snooping around the neighborhood. I think he's stealing packages." Officer Reynolds turned to Marcus, his expression neutral. "Can I see some ID?" Marcus nodded, pulling out his delivery ID badge and handing it over. "I'm just delivering packages, officer." The officer examined the badge, then glanced at the truck behind him. "Everything checks out. I'm going to need you to back off," he said, turning to Derek. Derek wasn't satisfied. "You're just going to let him walk away? This is my neighborhood." Officer Reynolds sighed. "There's no evidence of wrongdoing here. If you have an issue, take it up with the delivery company." As the officer turned to leave, Derek shouted after him, "This isn't over!" Marcus exhaled slowly, watching as the officer drove away. He wasn't naive enough to think that Derek was finished, but for now he could breathe a little easier. The afternoon heat was oppressive as Marcus continued his deliveries, but the weight on his chest felt even heavier than the sun beating down. He kept replaying the confrontation with Derek in his mind, each time growing more frustrated. The man's accusations were like a slow, steady pressure building up inside him, but Marcus knew he couldn't let it show. He had been in situations like this before, and staying calm was his best defense. As Marcus pulled up to his next stop, he noticed something strange. People were watching him, not just one or two neighbors, but several. Some were standing on their porches, others peering through windows. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Word had spread. He could feel it in the way they glanced at him, in the way their conversations seemed to quiet as he passed. He parked the truck in front of a large, two-story home with perfectly trimmed hedges and a bright red front door. The name on the package was Mr. and Mrs. Hill. He grabbed the medium-sized box and walked toward the house, forcing himself to stay focused on his work. But the silence that followed him felt suffocating. As he reached the front steps, he heard a voice from behind. "Hey, you! What are you doing here?" Marcus stopped mid-step, his body tensing. He turned slowly to see a man standing on the sidewalk, watching him with narrowed eyes. It wasn't Derek this time. but someone else, a neighbor he didn't recognize. The man was holding a phone in his hand, as if ready to call the police at any moment. "Just delivering a package," Marcus said, his voice calm but strained. The man didn't move, didn't blink. "You sure about that?" Marcus clenched his jaw, his patience running thin. "Yes, it's my job." The man stared at him for a moment longer, before finally turning and walking away, muttering something under his breath. Marcus exhaled, setting the package down on the porch and quickly returning to his truck. As the afternoon dragged on, Marcus couldn't shake the growing tension in the air. Every house, every stop, it felt like more eyes were on him. The quiet of the neighborhood, once peaceful, now felt suffocating. He knew that Derek's accusations had spread. The neighbors didn't need much to start suspecting him. Just a word, a glance, and suddenly, Marcus was no longer just the delivery man. He was something else in their eyes, a potential threat. Marcus was halfway through his deliveries when the sound of a car engine caught his attention. He turned to see Derek's truck pulling up behind him. Derek got out, his face set in that same hard expression he'd worn earlier. This time, though, he wasn't alone. A couple of other neighbors stood at a distance, watching but not approaching. "What are you doing here again?" Derek demanded, his voice louder than before. "Didn't I already tell you we don't need you snooping around?" Marcus sighed, keeping his hands at his sides, his body tense but calm. "Like I said earlier, I'm just doing my job. I'm almost done here." "You don't belong here," Derek continued, stepping closer. "I've seen you driving around, stopping at houses that don't even have packages. You're up to something." Marcus clenched his fists, willing himself to stay composed. "I'm following my delivery route. If you've got a problem, you can call my company. I've got nothing to prove to you." Derek's face twisted in anger. "I already did. They told me you're assigned here, but I don't buy it. I've been watching you. You think you can fool me?" Marcus exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Look, man, I'm just here to deliver packages and go home. I don't want any trouble." Derek's voice rose another notch. "Trouble? You're the one causing trouble, coming into our neighborhood like you own the place. I'm calling the police again, and this time they'll get it right." Before Marcus could respond, Derek pulled out his phone and began dialing. Marcus didn't move, didn't try to stop him. He had no choice but to let it play out again. It wasn't the first time he'd been falsely accused, and sadly, he knew it wouldn't be the last. Within minutes, the flashing lights of a police car appeared at the end of the street, and Officer Stephen Reynolds was back. As the officer stepped out of his cruiser, he adjusted his sunglasses, his expression less neutral this time, more cautious. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Officer Reynolds said, his voice flat. "What's going on now?" Derek wasted no time. "He's been snooping around again. I told you he's up to something. I've seen him walking around houses, looking like he's casing the place. You've got to do something." Officer Reynolds turned to Marcus, raising an eyebrow. "Sir, we've been through this already." Marcus nodded, his frustration barely concealed. "Yes, officer. I'm just delivering packages, same as before." "Let me see your ID again," Officer Reynolds said, though his tone carried a hint of weariness. Marcus handed over his delivery badge without a word, watching as the officer checked it against the list on his phone. "Everything still checks out," Officer Reynolds said, turning back to Derek. "Sir, he's the delivery driver for this area. He's not doing anything wrong." Derek's face turned red with anger. "You're just going to let him keep doing this? He doesn't belong here." Officer Reynolds' patience was clearly wearing thin. "Sir, unless you have any evidence of wrongdoing, I'm going to ask you to let this go. We've confirmed everything." But Derek wasn't backing down. "This neighborhood is going downhill because of people like him. You're letting him get away with it." Before Derek could continue, a voice cut through the tension. "Derek, that's enough." Everyone turned to see Emily Carter stepping out from her front porch, her arms crossed, her expression firm. She walked toward the group, her steps deliberate. "He's clearly the delivery driver," Emily said, her voice calm but unwavering. "He's wearing a uniform, driving a marked truck. What more do you need?" Derek turned to face her, his face twisted in disbelief. "Emily, stay out of this. You don't know what's going on." "I know exactly what's going on," Emily shot back, her tone icy. "And it needs to stop. You're embarrassing yourself and everyone else in this neighborhood." Derek's face reddened further, but before he could say anything, Officer Reynolds stepped in. "All right, that's enough. Sir, unless you have any new information, we're done here." For a moment, Derek looked like he was about to argue, but the weight of the officer's words and Emily's presence seemed to finally sink in. He muttered something under his breath and stormed back to his truck, slamming the door behind him. Officer Reynolds handed Marcus back his ID. "Sorry about this," he said, his voice low. "You're free to go." Marcus nodded, grateful but still tense. "Thanks, officer." As Marcus climbed back into his truck, he caught Emily's eye. She gave him a small nod of support, and he returned it with a tired smile. But even as he drove away, Marcus knew this wasn't over. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns as Marcus continued his deliveries. The encounter with Derek and Officer Reynolds had left him drained, both physically and emotionally. Still, Marcus kept moving, focusing on finishing his route and getting out of Oakwood Hills for the day. But the neighborhood wasn't done with him yet. As Marcus pulled up to his next stop, he noticed a familiar face on the porch. A middle-aged woman who had been watching him earlier. She was watering her plants, though her gaze was fixed on Marcus as he approached her house with a package in hand. "Mrs. Hill?" Marcus asked, glancing at the name on the label. "I've got a delivery for you." Mrs. Hill didn't respond immediately. Instead, she continued watering her plants, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked Marcus up and down. He could feel her skepticism, the same doubt he'd felt from so many others today. "You're the new delivery guy, aren't you?" she finally said, her voice cold. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, keeping his tone polite, despite the fatigue weighing him down. "Just started this route a week ago." Mrs. Hill finally set her watering can down, wiping her hands on her apron as she stepped closer. "I've heard some things about you," she said slowly, her voice almost a whisper. "Derek says you've been snooping around." Marcus bit back a sigh, reminding himself to stay calm. "I'm just delivering packages, Mrs. Hill. I've got no business snooping around. I'm only here to do my job." She studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "I suppose that's what they all say." Her voice lacked the accusatory tone of Derek, but the skepticism lingered. Marcus handed her the package, offering a tight smile. "Have a good evening, ma'am." As he walked back to his truck, he couldn't help but feel the weight of her judgment. Another unspoken accusation hanging in the air. It didn't matter that Officer Reynolds had cleared him twice now. It didn't matter that he wore a uniform, drove a marked truck, and had all the proper paperwork. To people like Derek, and even Mrs. Hill, he was guilty until proven innocent. Marcus climbed into the truck, his shoulders heavy with frustration. He had just a few more deliveries left, and then he could leave this place behind for the day. But the thought of coming back tomorrow and the day after filled him with a deep sense of dread. As he pulled away from Mrs. Hill's house, Marcus's phone buzzed again. It was another message from his wife, Melanie. "Everything okay? You're usually home by now." Marcus stared at the screen for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't want to worry her, but he couldn't lie either. "Tough day, running late. I'll tell you about it when I get home." He hit send, then tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, exhaling slowly. He didn't have the energy to explain everything now, not until he was home, far away from the prying eyes of Oakwood Hills. Marcus was nearing the end of his route when he heard the sound of an engine revving behind him. He glanced in the rearview mirror and felt his stomach drop. Derek's truck was following him again, this time closer than before, almost tailgating him. "Come on, man," Marcus muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He pulled over to the curb in front of the next house, hoping Derek would keep driving. But instead, Derek's truck screeched to a halt behind him, blocking the road. Marcus stepped out of the delivery truck, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this wasn't going to end well. Derek got out of his truck, his face red with anger. "You didn't think I was just going to let you get away with it, did you?" he shouted, storming toward Marcus. Marcus stood his ground, keeping his hands at his sides, though his muscles were tense. "Get away with what, Derek? I'm just delivering packages. I'm not doing anything wrong." "Bull!" Derek spat, pointing an accusatory finger at Marcus. "I've seen you. You've been casing houses, looking for your next score. You think you can just come into my neighborhood and take whatever you want?" Marcus took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm not taking anything. I'm doing my job. You've seen me, and you've seen the truck. If you've got a problem, call my company. But this harassment needs to stop. Derek's face twisted in fury. Harassment? You're the one causing trouble. You don't belong here. Before Marcus could respond, he noticed more neighbors starting to gather. Mrs. Hill had stepped onto her porch again, watching from a distance. Across the street, a few others were peeking out from behind their curtains. But no one stepped in to help. No one came to his defense. Except for one. Derek, that's enough, a voice called from down the block. Marcus turned to see Emily walking toward them, her face set in determination. Derek whipped around to face her, his fists clenched. Stay out of this, Emily. This isn't your business. It became my business the moment you started harassing an innocent man, Emily shot back, her voice unwavering. He's done nothing wrong, Derek. You're the one making a scene. Derek's eyes blazed with anger. You don't know what you're talking about. I've seen him. He doesn't belong here. He belongs here as much as anyone else does, Emily countered, stepping closer. He's doing his job. You're the one who doesn't belong if you're going to keep acting like this. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward Emily, but he could also feel the tension in the air thickening. This wasn't going to end with words. Before anyone could say another word, the sound of sirens filled the air. Once again, a police car turned the corner, its lights flashing. Officer Stephen Reynolds stepped out, his expression hard as he approached the scene. What's going on now? Officer Reynolds asked, his voice tired but firm. Derek pointed at Marcus. He's been sneaking around again. He's up to something, officer. I know it. Officer Reynolds glanced at Marcus, then at Emily. Is this true? No, officer, Emily replied before Marcus could speak. Derek's been harassing him all day. Marcus is just doing his job. The officer turned to Marcus, raising an eyebrow. Do you have your paperwork? Marcus nodded, handing over his route sheet and ID. Everything's in order, officer. I've just got a couple more stops to make. Officer Reynolds flipped through the papers, then sighed. Everything checks out. Derek, we've been through this already. Derek's face turned bright red. You're just going to let him get away with it? This is my neighborhood. He doesn't belong here. Officer Reynolds stepped forward, his voice firm. Sir, unless you have concrete evidence that a crime has been committed, you need to let this go. If you continue to harass this man, there will be consequences. For a moment, Derek looked like he was about to explode. His fists clenched and unclenched, his face twisted with rage. But then slowly he backed down. This isn't over, Derek muttered, glaring at Marcus one last time before turning back to his truck. Marcus exhaled, the tension in his body slowly releasing. He glanced at Emily, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. You okay? She asked, her voice soft. Marcus nodded, though he still felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. Yeah, thanks for stepping in. Emily smiled faintly. Someone had to. Officer Reynolds handed Marcus back his papers, giving him a sympathetic look. Sorry about all this. You're free to go. As Marcus climbed back into his truck, he couldn't help but feel a sense of exhaustion, not just from the deliveries, but from the constant battle of trying to prove he belonged. It was a battle he knew wasn't over yet. As Marcus drove away from the scene, the setting sun bathed the quiet streets of Oakwood Hills in a soft golden light. The beauty of the neighborhood was in stark contrast to the turmoil simmering inside him. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white, trying to focus on finishing his deliveries. Only a couple of stops left, he reminded himself. Then he could finally leave the neighborhood and the day behind. But no matter how hard he tried to focus on the job, the words from earlier stuck with him. You don't belong here. It wasn't the first time Marcus had heard those words, but today they felt heavier. It wasn't just about Derek or even Oakwood Hills. It was about a world where people like Derek could make snap judgments, assume the worst, and turn a simple job into a nightmare. And what made it worse was that Marcus knew this wouldn't be the last time. There would be more Dereks down the road, more days like today. As he turned the corner onto Maple Street, Marcus glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting Derek to still be following him. Thankfully, the street was empty behind him. But even without Derek's presence, Marcus could still feel the weight of the neighbors' eyes on him. Mrs. Hill, the man with the phone, the others who had peeked through their windows earlier. They were all part of the same silent accusation. It wasn't just Derek who thought Marcus didn't belong. Marcus pulled up to the last house on his route. It was a modest one-story home with a bright yellow door. As he stepped out of the truck, he saw movement in the window, someone watching him, as usual. He grabbed the last package and made his way up the driveway, trying to ignore the feeling of being scrutinized. Just as he reached the door, a voice called out from across the street. "Hey!" Marcus turned to see Mrs. Hill standing at the edge of her driveway, her watering can in hand. She didn't look angry or accusatory this time. If anything, she looked hesitant. "I saw what happened earlier," she said, her voice softer than before. "With Derek." Marcus nodded, unsure of where this was going. "Yeah, it's been a long day." Mrs. Hill shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her expression unreadable. "Derek can be difficult," she said slowly. "He thinks he's protecting the neighborhood, but sometimes he takes things too far." Marcus wasn't sure how to respond. Was this an apology? A justification? Mrs. Hill seemed to sense his confusion. She set the watering can down and took a step closer. "I just wanted to say, I don't think you're doing anything wrong. I don't agree with how Derek handled things." Marcus raised an eyebrow, a mixture of surprise and relief washing over him. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Hill." She nodded, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "Not everyone here is like Derek, you know. Some of us just want to live our lives in peace, and we don't see you as a threat." Marcus smiled faintly, though the weariness in his body was hard to shake. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that." Mrs. Hill gave him a small, tight smile before turning back to her house. Marcus watched her retreat inside, the door clicking shut behind her. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small gesture of support in a day filled with hostility. Marcus placed the package on the doorstep, took one last look at the quiet street, and returned to his truck. The day was finally over, but the tension in his chest lingered. He could leave Oakwood Hills for now, but he knew he'd be back tomorrow, and so would Derek. By the time Marcus pulled into his driveway that evening, the sky had darkened, and the stars were just beginning to peek through the twilight. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting the exhaustion settle in. His muscles ached, and his mind was racing with everything that had happened. The confrontation with Derek, the police involvement, the constant feeling of being watched. It was all too much. He knew he had to tell Melanie about it. They'd been through these situations before, and she was always his source of calm, but today had felt different. Worse somehow. Stepping out of the truck, Marcus grabbed his things and made his way to the front door. The smell of something warm and comforting greeted him as soon as he stepped inside, and for the first time that day, Marcus allowed himself to relax just a little. "Honey, I'm home," he called out, trying to keep his voice light. Melanie appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her smile faltered when she saw his tired expression. "Hey, you're late. Everything okay?" Marcus shrugged, dropping his bag by the door. "Just a rough day on the new route." Melanie frowned, crossing the room to give him a quick hug. "What happened?" Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "Same old story. Got accused of stealing packages. Derek called the cops, twice." Melanie pulled back slightly, her brow furrowed in concern. "Are you serious? The police came twice?" "Yeah," Marcus said, his voice heavy with frustration. "And even though the cop cleared me both times, Derek wouldn't back off. He kept following me, kept trying to accuse me of something." Melanie shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. "That's ridiculous. He has no right to do that." "I know," Marcus said quietly, "but that doesn't stop people like him." Melanie sighed, rubbing his arm comfortingly. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I hate that you have to deal with this." "I hate it too," Marcus muttered, sinking into the couch. "It's exhausting, always having to prove I belong somewhere." Melanie sat beside him, taking his hand. "You do belong, Marcus. You know that, right? You're not the problem." Marcus smiled faintly, though the weight of the day still hung over him. "I know. It's just hard to feel like that when everyone around you acts like you're the enemy." Melanie nodded, her expression softening. You're strong, Marcus. You've been through this before, and you'll get through it again. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Yeah, but it doesn't make it any easier. They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the house slowly easing the tension from Marcus's body. Melanie leaned her head on his shoulder, offering quiet support. It wasn't a solution to the problem, but it was a comfort he desperately needed. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a heavy heart. He knew he had to return to Oakwood Hills today. His route was the same, and so was the dread that settled in his stomach. Melanie had already left for work, but she'd left a note on the kitchen table. You're stronger than they are. Don't let them get to you. Love, Mel. Marcus smiled at the note, folding it and putting it in his pocket. He'd need the reminder today. As he drove through the streets of Oakwood Hills, everything looked the same as it had the day before. The well-manicured lawns, the pristine homes, the quiet tension that hung in the air. But Marcus felt different. He was more prepared now. Derek might still be lurking, but Marcus wasn't going to let him ruin another day. He pulled up to his first stop, stepping out of the truck and grabbing the first package. His eyes scanned the street, half expecting Derek's truck to come barreling down the road, but everything remained quiet. As Marcus walked up to the door, he saw Mrs. Hill again, standing on her porch with a mug of coffee in hand. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, a quiet gesture of solidarity. Marcus returned the nod, feeling a flicker of hope. Not everyone in this neighborhood was like Derek. Maybe today would be different. The morning was quiet, almost peaceful, as Marcus moved through his deliveries. The first few stops went smoothly. No accusations, no confrontations, just the routine he was used to. Still, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. People like Derek didn't just let things go. As Marcus approached his fourth stop of the day, a familiar sense of dread settled in his gut. He pulled up in front of a large beige house with perfectly trimmed hedges and a red brick walkway. This was a house he had been to before, but today felt different. He grabbed the package and stepped out of the truck, scanning the street for any sign of Derek or his truck. So far, nothing. Just as Marcus turned to walk toward the house, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of tires screeching on pavement. He turned to see Derek's truck speeding around the corner, barreling toward him with reckless speed. Derek's face was twisted in anger, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Here we go," Marcus muttered under his breath, bracing himself for another confrontation. Derek screeched to a halt, blocking the road in front of Marcus's truck. He jumped out, slamming the door behind him, and marched straight toward Marcus, his fist clenched. "You think you can just keep coming back here, don't you?" Derek shouted, his voice booming down the quiet street. "You think we're just going to let you walk around like you belong here?" Marcus took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm. "I'm just here to do my job, Derek. You need to stop this." Derek ignored him, stepping closer, his face flushed with rage. "You're stealing from us. I know it. You're casing these houses, waiting for your chance. But not on my watch." Marcus stood his ground, his muscles tense. He wasn't going to back down this time. "I'm not stealing anything. I'm delivering packages. You're the one causing trouble." Neighbors began to step out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Hill was there again, standing on her porch with her arms crossed. Across the street, more people emerged, watching silently, but no one stepped forward to intervene, except for Emily. Once again, she came marching down the sidewalk, her expression a mixture of anger and determination. "Derek, stop this right now," she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. "You're harassing him, and we're all sick of it." Derek turned to face her, his eyes wild with frustration. "You don't know what you're talking about, Emily. I'm protecting the neighborhood." "You're making a fool of yourself," Emily shot back, stepping closer to him. "Marcus isn't doing anything wrong. He's just doing his job, and you're out here trying to ruin his life because you can't handle the fact that he works here." Derek's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. "Dad, stop!" Everyone turned to see Kelly, Derek's teenage daughter, standing at the end of the driveway. She looked horrified, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's not a threat. He's just delivering packages. Derek looked stunned for a moment, as if he hadn't expected his daughter to get involved. Kelly, you don't understand. No, you don't understand, Kelly interrupted, tears welling in her eyes. This isn't about protecting the neighborhood. You're just angry and you're taking it out on him because you don't like the way he looks. It's wrong, Dad. The street fell silent. All eyes were on Derek now. His face went pale as Kelly's words sunk in. For a moment he looked like he might argue, but something in his daughter's voice stopped him. He glanced around, seeing the neighbors watching him, his own daughter standing against him, and finally his anger seemed to deflate. I'm just trying to keep us safe, Derek muttered, his voice barely audible. This isn't keeping us safe, Dad, Kelly said softly. You're hurting people. You're hurting me. Derek looked at his daughter, then back at Marcus. His face was still tight with emotion, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. For the first time, Marcus saw something other than rage in Derek's expression. He saw confusion, maybe even guilt. Before anyone could say anything else, the familiar wail of police sirens filled the air once again. Officer Stephen Reynolds pulled up, his expression a mix of frustration and weariness as he stepped out of his cruiser. What's going on now? Officer Reynolds asked, looking between Derek, Marcus, and the growing crowd of neighbors. Emily spoke first. Derek's harassing Marcus again. It needs to stop. Officer Reynolds turned to Derek, his face stern. Sir, I warned you the last time. If this continues, there will be legal consequences. Derek opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Kelly stepped forward. It's over, Dad. Please, just stop. Derek's shoulders slumped. He looked down at the ground, his face flushed with shame. Finally, he nodded. Fine, he muttered, turning away from Marcus. Fine. It's over. Officer Reynolds nodded, satisfied. Good. Now, Marcus, do you need anything else from me? Marcus shook his head, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. No, officer. I think we're done here. The officer gave a nod of approval and turned to leave, but not before giving Derek one last warning. If this happens again, we're filing charges. Understood? Derek didn't respond. He just walked back to his truck, his daughter following behind him, her expression a mixture of sadness and disappointment. The tension in the air finally seemed to lift as Derek drove away. Marcus stood by his truck, watching as the crowd of neighbors slowly dispersed. Some gave him sympathetic nods, others simply went back into their homes without saying a word. But Emily stayed behind, walking up to Marcus with a tired smile. You okay? She asked, her voice soft. Marcus nodded, though he still felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. Yeah, I think so. Emily glanced down the street where Derek had driven off. I don't think he'll bother you again. Kelly really got through to him. Marcus nodded again, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. People like Derek didn't change overnight. But for now at least, the harassment had stopped. That was enough. Thanks for standing up for me, Marcus said, giving Emily a small smile. I appreciate it. Emily shrugged, though there was a warmth in her eyes. It was the right thing to do. You shouldn't have to go through this alone. Marcus looked around at the now quiet street. Mrs. Hill was still watching from her porch, and a few others lingered, their gazes softening now that Derek was gone. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he felt. You're not alone, Emily said again, as if reading his thoughts. People like Derek are loud, but there are more of us who see you for who you really are. Marcus smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. Thanks, Emily. She gave him one last nod before turning to head back to her house. As Marcus climbed back into his truck, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. The day had been long, exhausting, and full of tension. But it was over now. And for the first time in days, Marcus believed that tomorrow might actually be better. The next day felt different. As Marcus drove back into Oakwood Hills, the usual sense of dread that accompanied his arrival wasn't as heavy. The morning was bright, the air fresh, and while the memories of Derek's harassment lingered, there was a shift in the atmosphere. He didn't know if it was because of Kelly's confrontation with her father, Emily's vocal support, or the police officer's final warning. But something had changed. Marcus parked his truck at the first house on his route. As he stepped out and grabbed the first package, he scanned the street as he usually did, expecting to see the familiar faces of skeptical neighbors. But this time, something was different. Instead of suspicious eyes peeking through curtains, Marcus noticed Mrs. Hill standing on her porch, giving him a small wave. "Good morning, Marcus," she called out, her voice unusually cheerful. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but returned the wave. "Morning, Mrs. Hill." It wasn't a big gesture, but it was enough to catch him off guard. Maybe yesterday had left more of an impact than he thought. As he delivered the package to her neighbor's house, Marcus noticed more small, subtle changes. Neighbors who had once given him skeptical glances now nodded politely as he passed. Others, who had remained hidden behind their curtains, now stepped outside and greeted him with cautious smiles. It wasn't perfect. There was still an underlying tension in the air, but it was progress. At his third stop, Marcus encountered something he never expected. Kelly. She was standing at the end of her driveway, her backpack slung over one shoulder, waiting for her ride to school. When she saw Marcus, she hesitated for a moment, then walked toward him, her expression filled with uncertainty. "Hey," Kelly said softly, stopping a few feet away from him. "Hey," Marcus replied, unsure of what to say. Kelly looked down at the ground, scuffing her shoe against the pavement. "I'm really sorry about everything that happened with my dad. I didn't know how to stop him before, but I should have said something sooner." Marcus could see the guilt in her eyes, and for the first time, he felt a sense of compassion for her. It couldn't have been easy, standing up to her father the way she did. "You don't need to apologize for your dad," Marcus said, his voice gentle. "What you did yesterday took a lot of courage." Kelly looked up at him, her eyes filled with relief. I don't want you to think everyone in this neighborhood is like him." Marcus smiled faintly. "I don't. It's easy to feel like the whole world is against you when people like Derek are so loud. But I know not everyone's like that. You helped remind me of that." Kelly smiled, her face brightening a little. "Thanks. I just hope he actually listens this time. I know it's not an excuse, but he's been under a lot of stress lately." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure what more to say. He didn't know what struggles Derek was dealing with, and while it didn't excuse his behavior, Marcus knew that change was complicated. "I hope so too," Marcus said. "But even if he doesn't, you did the right thing." Kelly's ride pulled up to the curb, and she gave Marcus one last nod before getting into the car. As she drove away, Marcus watched her go, feeling a strange sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. By the time Marcus reached the halfway point in his route, he was starting to notice more changes in the way people treated him. Emily had been right. Derek's voice had been the loudest, but now that it had been quieted, other voices were beginning to emerge. At one stop, a middle-aged man named Mr. Thompson waved Marcus down as he was heading back to his truck. "Hey, Marcus," Mr. Thompson called, jogging over to him. Marcus stopped, surprised by the man's sudden friendliness. "Hey, how's it going?" Mr. Thompson smiled and handed Marcus a cold bottle of water. "I saw you out here working hard. Figured you could use a drink." Marcus blinked, taken aback by the gesture. "Oh, wow, thanks. I appreciate it." "No problem," Mr. Thompson said with a shrug. "Listen, I just wanted to say I saw what happened yesterday with Derek. That was pretty rough. I don't agree with what he did." Marcus nodded, taking a sip of the water. "Yeah, it was a tough day." Mr. Thompson glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Derek's been making trouble around here for a while. You're not the first person he's gone after, but I think what happened yesterday is going to keep him quiet for a while." Marcus didn't know what to say. He had always assumed that the neighbors supported Derek's behavior, but hearing Mr. Thompson's words gave him a new perspective. "Well, I'm just glad it's over," Marcus said. "At least for now." Mr. Thompson nodded. "If he gives you any more trouble, you've got people around here who will stand up for you." Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson. That means a lot." Mr. Thompson waved as he headed back toward his house, leaving Marcus with a renewed sense of hope. Maybe this neighborhood wasn't as hostile as he had thought. As Marcus continued his route, he noticed more and more neighbors offering small gestures of support. Some waved or smiled as he passed, others brought out water or snacks, thanking him for his hard work. It was a stark contrast to the hostility he had faced just a few days ago, and while not everyone had changed their tune, it was enough to make Marcus feel like things were improving. At his last stop of the day, Marcus pulled up to Emily's house. She was waiting on the porch, a bright smile on her face as he approached. Good to see you, Marcus, Emily said warmly. Good to see you too, Marcus replied, handing her the package. Thanks again for everything yesterday. I don't know how things would have gone if you hadn't stepped in. Emily waved a hand dismissively. You don't need to thank me. You shouldn't have had to go through that in the first place. Still, Marcus said, it meant a lot. I'm starting to see things are changing, slowly but surely. Emily nodded, her expression softening. People like Derek are loud, but they don't speak for everyone. Sometimes it just takes a little push to remind people what's right. Marcus smiled, feeling lighter than he had in days. Yeah, I think you're right. As Marcus turned to leave, Emily called after him. If you ever need anything, just let me know. You've got friends in this neighborhood. Marcus glanced back at her, feeling a wave of gratitude. Thanks, Emily. I appreciate that. The sun was beginning to set as Marcus finished his last delivery and headed home. The sky was painted with streaks of pink and orange, and for the first time in what felt like a long time, Marcus allowed himself to relax. The day had been different, not perfect, but better. As he pulled into his driveway and stepped out of the truck, Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had made it through the storm, and while there were still challenges ahead, he knew now that he wasn't alone. Inside the house, Melanie was waiting for him with a warm smile and open arms. How was today? She asked, pulling him into a hug. Marcus leaned into her embrace, feeling the tension in his shoulders finally melt away. It was good, he said softly. Really good. Melanie smiled, her eyes filled with love and pride. I knew it would get better. Marcus nodded, resting his forehead against hers. Yeah, I think it finally is. As they stood together in the quiet of their home, Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead might still be bumpy, but he knew he could handle whatever came next. He had his family, his strength, and now a growing sense of community behind him. And that was more than enough. A few weeks passed, and the tension that had once gripped Oakwood Hills had all but dissipated. Marcus had settled into his routine, and while Derek remained distant and kept to himself, the hostility from the other neighbors had largely faded. Marcus had become a familiar face, no longer viewed as an outsider or a threat, but as part of the neighborhood fabric. The change had been gradual but noticeable. Each morning as Marcus made his deliveries, he was met with friendly nods, waves, and the occasional small talk from the neighbors. Even Mrs. Hill, who had once eyed him with suspicion, now greeted him with a smile when he stopped by her house. There was still the occasional unease. Old habits and biases don't disappear overnight. But Marcus knew the worst was behind him. Derek's aggressive actions had forced the neighborhood to confront its prejudices, and while not everyone had fully changed, there was a sense that progress had been made. One day, as Marcus was wrapping up his deliveries, he noticed a familiar truck parked a few houses down. Derek was outside tending to his lawn. Marcus felt the old tension creep back into his chest, but this time, it wasn't as strong. Derek wasn't paying him any mind, no glares, no confrontations. It seemed Derek had learned to keep his distance. As Marcus walked back to his truck, he was surprised to see Kelly standing at the edge of her driveway, watching him with a hesitant smile. Hey, she called out as Marcus approached. Got a minute? Marcus paused, unsure of what she wanted. Sure, what's up? Kelly fidgeted with the strap of her backpack, glancing over at her father, who was still absorbed in his work. I just wanted to check in, see how things have been for you since, everything that happened. Marcus smiled slightly. Things have been good. A lot better, actually. People are more welcoming now. Kelly nodded, looking relieved. I'm glad. I've been talking to my dad, trying to get him to see things differently. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And how's that going? Kelly let out a soft laugh. Slowly. He's stubborn, but I think he's starting to get it. I don't know if he'll ever fully change, but at least he stopped bothering you. Marcus glanced over at Derek, who was still busy trimming his hedges, and nodded. Yeah, I've noticed. That's something. Kelly hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. I'm sorry, Marcus. For everything. I should have done more to stop him sooner. It wasn't right what he did. Marcus studied her face for a moment, then shook his head. You don't need to apologize, Kelly. You did the hardest thing, standing up to your own family. That takes guts. You helped change things. Kelly smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. Thanks. I just hope I can keep helping him change. Marcus gave her a reassuring nod. You're doing more than most people would. Just keep at it. As Kelly turned to head back inside, Marcus couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope for Derek. It wasn't a guarantee that he would change, but with Kelly in his life, there was at least a chance. Sometimes that was enough. A few weeks later, Marcus was finishing his last delivery of the day when something caught his attention. A group of neighbors was gathered at the park just down the street from his usual route, setting up tables and chairs under the shade of the tall oak trees. There were balloons, a grill being fired up, and the smell of fresh food wafting through the air. Curious, Marcus finished his last stop and drove over to the park. As he parked his truck, he spotted Emily waving at him from across the field. Marcus, come on over, she called, her voice full of warmth. Marcus smiled and made his way toward the gathering. As he got closer, he realized this wasn't just a small neighborhood get-together. It was a community event, a block party of sorts, with families milling about, children running around, and neighbors chatting with one another. What's all this? Marcus asked as he approached Emily. She grinned. We figured it was time for a neighborhood gathering, something positive to bring everyone together. After everything that happened, we wanted to show that we're more united than divided. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And you're sure I'm welcome here? Emily chuckled. Of course you are. You're part of the neighborhood now, remember. Marcus looked around, feeling a strange sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. People were waving at him, offering him drinks, inviting him to join their conversations. Even Mrs. Hill was there, sitting at a table with a group of older women, smiling as she watched the kids play. I don't know what to say, Marcus admitted, still taking it all in. You don't have to say anything, Emily said, nudging him playfully. Just enjoy yourself. You've earned it. As Marcus wandered through the gathering, he felt the warmth of the community around him. People who had once viewed him with suspicion were now welcoming him with open arms. It wasn't perfect. There were still a few faces in the crowd that looked uncomfortable, unsure, but the change was real, and it was happening. At one point, Marcus spotted Derek standing near the grill, talking to a group of men. He was keeping to himself mostly, but Marcus noticed that his posture was more relaxed, less aggressive than before. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and while Derek didn't offer a smile or a wave, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Marcus. Sometimes progress came in small steps. The sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the park as the neighborhood gathering continued. Marcus found himself sitting at a picnic table, watching as the children played on the swings, and the adults laughed and chatted with one another. There was a sense of peace in the air, a calm that Marcus hadn't felt in a long time. Emily sat down next to him, handing him a plate of food. I told you things would get better, she said with a satisfied smile. Marcus took the plate, chuckling softly. Yeah, you did. I just didn't expect it to happen this fast. Emily shrugged. Sometimes all it takes is one person standing up and doing the right thing. The rest follow. Marcus nodded thoughtfully as he gazed out over the park. I guess you're right. I just never thought I'd see a day where this neighborhood felt welcoming. Emily smiled gently. Change takes time. It's not perfect, but you've earned their respect. And for what it's worth, you've always belonged here. Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him as the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the trees. He wasn't naive enough to believe that every trace of prejudice had disappeared, but he also knew that the small victories, the changes in attitude, the newfound sense of community, were worth celebrating. As they sat together in companionable silence, a familiar voice called out from across the field. Marcus! He turned to see Kelly walking toward him, her expression bright and full of purpose. She reached him, slightly out of breath, but her smile was wide. Hey, she said, slightly nervous. I wanted to let you know something. What's that? Marcus asked, curious. Kelly glanced around, ensuring no one else was listening. My dad, he's been talking to someone, a counselor, I think. It's slow, but he's trying to change. It's not easy for him, but I think he's starting to understand how wrong he was. Marcus was taken aback by the news. Really? Kelly nodded. Yeah, it doesn't excuse what he did, and he knows that. But I think he's finally facing his own issues. Marcus felt a mixture of emotions, surprise, relief, and even a sense of closure. I'm glad to hear that, Kelly. It takes a lot for someone to admit they were wrong. Yeah, Kelly agreed, a soft smile on her face. It's still hard for me to believe it, but I thought you should know. I didn't want you to think that he hadn't learned anything from what happened. Marcus gave her a grateful nod. Thanks for telling me, and thank you for standing up when it mattered. Kelly looked down, clearly humbled by the acknowledgement. I'm just glad I could help. As the block party wound down, Marcus said his goodbyes to the neighbors and returned to his delivery truck, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The park was now empty, save for a few families gathering their things. The event had brought a sense of closure to the turmoil that had once defined his experience in Oakwood Hills. As Marcus drove home that evening, he reflected on how far things had come. He hadn't set out to change anyone's mind when he first arrived, but somehow, through perseverance and the courage of a few allies, he had become part of the community. The once hostile and suspicious neighborhood was now a place of acceptance, or at least a place moving in the right direction. A few days later, Marcus found himself on his usual route, making deliveries in Oakwood Hills. The routine was familiar now, and so were the faces. There were no more angry confrontations, no more police calls, and no more accusations. Instead, the neighborhood had settled into a calm rhythm. Even Derek, though still reserved, had kept his distance and no longer watched Marcus with suspicion. As Marcus approached Emily's house for his daily delivery, he was met with a wave and a smile, just like every other day. This time, however, she invited him to sit on the porch for a quick chat. How's the day going? She asked, handing him a glass of lemonade. Can't complain, Marcus said with a grin. It's been a lot quieter lately. Emily nodded. That's a good thing. You've earned some peace. They chatted for a while, talking about the changes in the neighborhood, the future, and the ways people can grow. Marcus felt at ease, comfortable in a way he hadn't been when he first started working the route. He knew now that despite everything, Oakwood Hills had become a better place, and he had played a part in that transformation. As Marcus got ready to leave, Emily looked at him seriously. You've made a real difference here, Marcus. People notice that. Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of pride that he hadn't expected. Thanks, Emily. I just did what I had to. She shook her head. No, you did more than that. You stood your ground when it wasn't easy, and you helped the rest of us see what we needed to change. Marcus appreciated the sentiment but remained humble. I couldn't have done it alone. You didn't, Emily said, her smile soft. But you were the reason the rest of us started to act. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus felt the weight of the past slowly lift from his shoulders. Oakwood Hills, once a place of tension and unease, had become part of his daily life, and the people, once wary, had come to accept him not just as the delivery driver, but as someone who belonged. One day, Marcus made his usual rounds, noticing something out of the ordinary. When he arrived at Derek's house, Kelly was standing outside with a package in her hands. I think this one's yours, she said with a grin. Marcus laughed. I think that's supposed to be my job. Kelly handed him the package, her smile full of warmth. Maybe, but today's different. As Marcus took the package, he noticed that the tension between them was gone. Kelly was more confident, more sure of herself, and the air between them felt lighter. Thanks, Marcus said, appreciating the gesture. You know, you've grown a lot through all of this. Kelly shrugged. I had to. People like my dad needed to learn, and I needed to help. Marcus nodded. You did good. You should be proud of yourself. Kelly smiled again, this time more modestly. Thanks, I'm trying. As Marcus drove away, he realized that Oakwood Hills wasn't just a place of tension anymore. It was a place of growth. The people here, from Emily to Kelly, had learned to change. And while Derek might never be perfect, the fact that he had stepped back was progress in itself. Months passed, and Marcus continued his work in Oakwood Hills without further incidents. The tension that had once defined his interactions with the residents had dissolved, replaced with the kind of casual, everyday friendliness that most people take for granted. Marcus was no longer the new guy or the outsider. He was simply Marcus, the delivery driver who had become part of their daily lives. One evening, as Marcus sat on his porch at home, Melanie joined him, holding 2 cups of tea. She sat down beside him, her expression soft and peaceful. "Looks like things have finally settled down," Melanie said, handing him a cup. Marcus smiled, taking a sip of the warm tea. "Yeah, it feels that way." "You did it," Melanie said, her voice full of pride. "You stuck it out, and now things are better." Marcus looked out at the sunset, the sky streaked with hues of orange and pink. "I didn't do it alone. There were people who helped, people who stood up when it mattered." Melanie nodded. "That's true, but you were the one who kept going when it got hard. That made all the difference." Marcus leaned back, letting the warmth of the tea and the love from his wife settle over him. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I guess it did." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus felt a sense of peace wash over him. The struggles of the past were still there, but they were no longer burdens. They were reminders of how far he had come and how much had changed. And with that, Marcus knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he could face them, because he wasn't alone. He had a community now. He had his strength, his family, and most importantly, he had hope. The future looked brighter than ever. If you enjoyed this story and found it as thrilling and captivating as I did, please consider hitting that subscribe button to stay updated with more incredible tales like this one. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on any new stories, and you'll be the first to experience the twists and turns of every adventure. Don't forget to turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon, so you're always in the loop when new content drops. Your support truly helps this channel grow and allows me to continue creating stories that inspire, entertain, and connect us all. Thanks for being a part of this journey. Join our community and let's continue exploring together.